Hi, I'm Linda Lynch. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Lane County. And usually at the beginning of this luncheon, there's people coming up to me telling me, don't forget to announce this or don't forget to say that. I have no notes other than the fruit sale orders are due today and there are copies on your table. So I hope that you also noticed, oh, look, it coincides with the announcement. Perfect. I'm going to turn this over today to Sharon Posner, who's going to introduce our speakers. Sharon, you know, is a 50-plus year member of the League of Women Voters and is a past president. And she was president the first time I ever joined the board, way long time ago. So, Sharon.
I'm happy to take credit for Linda. Well, this is a fascinating time to be a political scientist. All the big issues, from racism, nationalism, to our basic institutions, have been written out in large letters and on the big screen before us the past few months. In this audience, we probably have about 80 or so, I think, amateur political scientists, right? Full of curiosity, opinions, and questions about the election campaign and the elections we've just experienced. And today we are exceedingly fortunate to have two experienced professionals in the art and the science of politics and political science to share their expertise and analysis with us. Professor Joe Lowndes received his BA from Antioch College and his master's and PhD degrees from the New School for Social Research in New York City. He's published extensively in the fields of race relations, populism, and political cultural development. He's brought his analysis to bear on politicians running the gamut from Barack Obama to William Buckley, and is currently working on a book entitled In Search of Middle America, Right-Wing Populism from Nixon to Trump. He's been a professor at the University of Oregon since 2003, right? Professor Priscilla Southwell received her BA and master's degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder and her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's been a professor at the University of Oregon since 1981 and has been active not only as a teacher and researcher, but as a dean and administrator in the College of Arts and Science. Her interests and expertise range from governance in Oregon to the development of third parties in Greece, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, not to mention all the issues of campaign spending, voter alienation, women's rights. So now it's a pleasure to have our guest speakers come up, and they'll speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions. So, if you'd like to come up.
So thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Linda, and thank you all for inviting me, and Priscilla Southwell, my great colleague, and for being here today. As Sharon said, I've been writing on populism and right-wing populism for the last couple of years. My first book was on the rise of conservatism in the U.S. from the mid-1930s on. And so my career has been mostly focused on the relationship between conservatism and racial politics, and more recently, kind of the conservatism seems to shade over towards right-wing politics and even far right-wing politics. That's where my research trajectory has taken me. So in some ways, as the country gets worse, my career gets better. So the midterms, it's always better to interpret retrospectively than it is to try to predict what's going to happen in elections. And so I always, any political scientist who has any sense will studiously avoid any questions from reporters or anyone else about what's likely to happen. we can see, for instance, how famously political scientists failed to predict the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. But also, interpreting events that have happened can be a tricky business. It's easy and it's tempting to overinterpret from a snapshot like midterm elections, particularly a national election where many things were in play, many kind of spontaneous things shaping events, but also deep trends there as well. So there's wide variation, and it's difficult, and one should be cautious in trying to figure out exactly what it means. That said, there are a number of ways to look at what happened a week ago Tuesday, and so I'm just going to take up a few. Hopefully I'm not going to take too much time here because I know Professor Southwell has great things to say, drilling down on certain aspects of it. But also, I imagine everyone in this room has a very acute knowledge of politics, and I'm sure the questions and comments that should come afterwards will help us keep this going. I also have to apologize for a terrible cold that I'm battling, which I inherited from my children. It came through the house like a slow-moving bullet, and I knew that I was not going to be able to jump out of the way in time, and I didn't. Anyway, so first let's look at the election from the perspective of democracy itself. Voter turnout was historically high all over the country for a midterm election, reaching its highest level in 104 years, with 49.2% of eligible voters on estimate casting ballots. The last time more citizens came out during midterms was in 1914, when 50.4% of the electorate of voters cast ballots. The last time it was close was in the 1966 elections, in the middle of an incredibly heated decade with many things at stake. And it was 2 years after Johnson had been elected in '64. So this is a very intense midterm. It seems like we've been in these midterm elections for the last 2 years, right? Like everyone has been talking about them since November 2000. This is 2 years ago. We've been thinking about it, talking about it, wondering what's going to happen. And in that way, it has been really, and I think the exit polls and all the survey data from beforehand have borne out that largely this midterm was a referendum on the president. A lot of people came out because they so strongly opposed the president. A lot of people came out because they so strongly wanted to defend his agenda. Still, for all that, the U.S., as it always does, ranks towards the lower end in voter turnout among developed nations. Sweden, South Korea, Israel, New Zealand, Germany, and Canada and others still top U.S. voter turnout by wide margins. So we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much. So what does it look like? Latinos voted at about 11%, which is higher than has been the case previously, nearly matching the number of eligible Latino voters in the electorate, and up from 7% in 2016. Latinos made up a notable share of eligible voters in several states with competitive races for the U.S. Senate and for the governorship, including Texas, Arizona, Florida, and Nevada. An estimated 31% of youth turned out to vote in the 2018 midterms, an extraordinary increase over the approximate youth vote in 2014, and the highest rate of youth turnout in at least 25 years. Young people, as you know, don't tend to vote a lot. Although we are always laboring hard to tell our students in our classes that they may not be interested in politics, as the saying goes, but politics is interested in them. And if they happen to be awake at that moment in class, they may get that message. But we try to encourage as much civic engagement as possible among students. So what else about democracy? Well, the new Congress, set to take office in January nationally, is slated to be the most racially diverse in history. Record numbers of Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, and women of color will serve in the next legislative session. Most of the racial, gender, and religious diversity will be represented by Democratic lawmakers in the House and Senate, even though the party is the minority in the Senate. The Congress will be overwhelmingly white and male still compared to overall population. So there are strides that have been made, but it's still always shocking if you look at overall representation in national government, how white and male it remains. In another victory for democracy, voters in Florida voted to expand the electorate by finally getting rid of felony disenfranchisement. Such a change alters the status of over 1 million people who could not vote before. And we could actually spend all day just talking about what happened in Florida, or what's still happening in Florida, what continues to happen in Florida. And many of these things in play, they are difficult to interpret politically because one would think that it would be a strong Democratic vote that would bring such a strong majority out to vote to get rid of felon disenfranchisement, which means that people who felon disenfranchisement, or laws that have been on the books since the Jim Crow era, really in the late 19th century, to suppress voter turnout by the working poor, and particularly by African Americans after the end of Reconstruction. And these were based on old British common law statutes, but the rule was that if you had been convicted of a felony, you could no longer vote in elections. So that there's been felon disenfranchisement statutes on the books in a number of states, and they've slowly fallen away. They really came to light in 2000 around the election debacle that year, and Florida was one of the places where the issue of felon disenfranchisement was most acute. And Florida has had almost 20 years now to solve many of its democratic woes, and clearly it's only gone part way in terms of that, and we still have a lot going on there. They have not clearly been able to shape the voting system in a way that is easily countable, let's say. On the other side of the democracy ledger, however, there are still a lot of challenges that we see, and which came out in a very, very strong way in this election. Voter suppression was widespread and egregious in many states across the country. Georgia is perhaps the worst example, but by no means the only one. There, Secretary of State Brian Kemp used his official position to help his campaign by purging voter rolls and reducing voter access in African American communities. Now, you might ask why a Secretary of State running for governor still gets to run the election system as a hen guarding a fox guarding a hen house, but that was not a question that he was willing to take up, nor were his fellow Republicans in Georgia, nor really were Republicans across the country. And so it raised a number of questions from very early on. And in fact, there would be no real reason to think that this conflict of interest would produce good results. And we're seeing now a lot of potential malfeasance in Georgia. Kemp's office removed 1.5 million registered voters' names from the Georgia rolls. He also instituted an exact match system that canceled voter registrations that did not have the exact same spelling for names as they appear in other government databases. This, if you may recall, was one of the problems in Florida back in 2000. That system kept 53,000 voters, 70% of them African American, from being able to register. Kemp's office closed more than 200 polling places since 2012 and wanted to close more, especially ones in heavily black neighborhoods, but was prevented by a court order. Newly combined polling locations did not receive extra voting machines for Election Day, leading to waits of more than 4 hours at some sites. And there are other things as well we could go on about. Voter suppression tactics, such as locating inconvenient sites, having long lines, shorter hours in states around the country, have prevented people from voting. Other tactics like substantiated charges of voter fraud. Marco Rubio today is screaming about voter fraud in Florida. Discourage voting beforehand through the spread of disinformation, and delegitimize election systems themselves. Part of the result is widespread disillusionment and disempowerment. Okay, so there are some wins for democracy, maybe some losses for democracy. So there's something to look at on both sides. So what does the midterm mean for the parties themselves? For the Democrats, the 2018 midterms were definitely drenched with a blue wave. It's the most House seats gained by Democrats since the wave election following Watergate in 1974. Democrats also won a sizable number of white suburban voters, which I think was not quite predicted by Republican pollsters. Also, exit polls show that almost every subgroup of women moved towards the Democratic Party, including white women, Latinas, white college-educated women, white non-college-educated women, Democratic women, and independent women. The only groups that are inconclusive or stayed the same on a national level appear to be African American women and Republican women, whose voter loyalties seem to stay static. In the states where Latino votes were particularly high, Democrats won that vote, sometimes by a wide margin. In the Texas Senate race, 64% of Latinos voted for Beto O'Rourke, the Democrat, while 35% voted for Republican incumbent Ted Cruz. In the state's race for governor, about half of Latinos voted for Democrat Lupe Valdez, and 42% backed the Republican Greg Abbott. And so I think we can see going forward the as long predicted impact of the Latino vote is going to become even more so. I think it's come slower than people have thought that it would, but it may be becoming decisive in ever more elections across the country. And depending on how Republicans and Democrats situate themselves, this will decisively shape the electorate. Republicans have gone in a more nativist direction in ways that seem to have repelled a lot of Latino voters. Although even just a few years ago, George W. Bush had won upwards of 40% of the Latino vote. So it's not necessarily a demographic that's hard won for the Democrats necessarily. Democrats also won seven governorships across the country and over 300 state legislative seats. This will matter in 2020 because it's a census year and there will be redistricting across the states, and whoever's in control of state governments where this is happening is going to be decisive. Republicans, I would say nationally, Republicans seem to have gone in much more strongly for racism and xenophobia than they had in past elections. Although certainly not always, and not here in in Oregon, I'm happy to say. There were a record number of white supremacists who ran for office across the country. Very few of them got past the primaries, including Josh Powell here, who was in the Republican primaries for Phil Barnhart's seat, who blamed Jews and Muslims for all of our social ills. But mostly this did not have an impact nationally, except for in the case of Steve King in Iowa and Steve Scalise in Louisiana. I think broadly the Republican Party was unwilling to, I think a lot of Republican candidates did not want to bring Trump in to campaign for them. Nevertheless, very few stood against his comments about birthright citizenship. Very few opposed him on the question of what the caravan coming up through Central America meant. And so that meant that even in places where a strong racial campaign wasn't run, in some places there were very racist campaigns run, like the state of Florida again. But what it meant was that the party is either actively or passively acquiescing to a future which is going to be where races are won by trying to pull out a hard right white electorate coupled with voter suppression where it can be achieved. And this, I think, I've been arguing this for 2 years now. This is the direction the Republican Party is going. I think it's going to be very hard to turn that ship around. What that means for Democrats, I think, is an open question. It seems like Democrats might be moving in a more progressive direction, although it's unclear to see what's, right now, for instance, there's still a fight over whether or not Nancy Pelosi will be reelected be elected to Speaker of the House. There's a centrist Blue Dog caucus that's trying to prevent that. So it's unclear there, although there were a number of Bernie Sanders-inspired candidacies across the country which have pushed the party somewhat in a progressive direction. Well, I'm kind of running out of time here. I would say briefly, it's obviously, as we know, Oregon Democrats did very well and progressives did very well, not just in races but in ballot initiatives, keeping the governorship and winning a supermajority in the legislature. Newt Buehler ran as an old-school moderate Republican. We were just talking before about this being the old tradition of republicanism in Oregon. Although I think he had a hard time kind of keeping the moderates in Multnomah County together with elements which are probably further out on the right in eastern and southern Washington. So I think that was a challenge for him. Although he did, in the run-up to election, he was doing surprisingly well. Although he lost decisively. Professor Southwell will probably speak to you more about Oregon. But that's kind of my overview, and look forward to talking with you folks more about it. Thank you.
So thank you for having me here. My perspective is a little bit different than some. You'll see this in these, you can see that even in the first slide, a little more historical, because I'm used to at dinner parties and whatever, everyone talking about politics and getting depressed. And I'm always the one who said, well, just wait a little bit here. Let's just think about how much progress we have made. When my grandmother was born, she did not have the right to vote. When my mother was born, she did not have the right to vote. And you know, my grandparents, both of them, a different set, died of the flu at age 24 in 1919. So this is why I'm trying to sort of give a sense of, very briefly, because I am going to talk about the year of the woman. There are several years of the women, you notice that? I actually have women and I have years. So I just, obviously I want to talk a little bit about just getting the right to vote, which you all know, I'm preaching to the choir here, about how many strides we have taken. But you all know this, Oregon is pretty good right there. I had to have a dig at Switzerland here. You know, they followed after many, many years, and so I like the place. They have a nice mountain, but why did they wait so long? Anyway, I hope you're not of Swiss ancestry and I insulted you, but they were a little slow. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's Oregon. I think all of you know of the name Abigail Duniway. And so here she is with governor, and she is actually quite elderly at this point, so she has an acting president who is doing this. Notice this, though, even though I'm so proud of Oregon, look how many times it took to get it on the ballot and finally get it passed. Anyway, we're not as slow as Switzerland, but it took us a while. Go ahead. All right, and this, I didn't mince words here, the West is best. Okay, so we all know about the 19th Amendment, we all know about 1920. Lots of states, and there's a lot of variation here, but lots of states, best of all, the full suffrage, had full suffrage long before we had this constitutional amendment. And where are they? The West. The West is best. Now, you know, there's a lot of variation, and my mother and grandmother, born in Pennsylvania, had to wait. Okay, next one. Go on. All right. Now, this is a lot, and I've left out a lot, and this is a lot of facts, and it's not going to be on the quiz. But anyway, just remember, okay, you're just making progress year after year. And of course, I have to put in 1920 when the League of Women Voters was founded, 6 months before the actual vote on the constitutional amendment. So obviously rising out of the suffragette movement. All right, so we have first woman elected to the U.S. Senate, 1930, and then we skip a few years. First African-American woman, Shirley Chisholm. First Latino woman, we have to go to 1989, and then, you know, I'm going back and forth here, they're not necessarily in order. First Asian American woman elected to the House, Patsy Mink from Hawaii. Same thing in terms of the Senate in 2012, and then we have to wait till 2016 to see the first Latino woman elected to the U.S. Senate. But this is what I mean. We've made a lot of progress. There are a lot of firsts. Okay, go ahead. Oh, all right. Now, when we everybody talked about a long time ago that 2018 was going to be the year of the woman. And most of you know that 1992 was also called the year of the woman, although in terms of numbers, they were a lot fewer, but a record number of women elected to the House. But these are the names that we all remember. 2 of them are still in office. So next, and I have to have the quote from, this is a lot of words, but I had to put this in here because Senator McCluskey, Barbara, said, you know, you can read this. Calling 1992 the year of the women makes it sound like the year of the caribou or the year of the asparagus. We're not a fad or a fancy or a year. And she was right. It kept on being that way. And at that time, Carol Moseley, at that election year, Carol Moseley Braun was the first female African-American senator. And you can see, so until this year, 1992 was the record year for people elected to the House. Okay? All right. Again, this is a lot of facts, and I did send this to the League, so if you all want to use it for your classes or use it to have family discussions, this is it. So, obviously, as Joe was referring to, a record number of women elected to the House. I put it at 100 plus because there are still, I think, 8, maybe as of this morning, 7 undecided U.S. House seats, but in one case, there are 2 females running against each other, so that's why I know it's going to be over 100. and a lot of them newly elected, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the previous record, as I indicated, was in 1992. So for the Senate and the governor's races, these are not records, but they are still impressive. And then New Mexico, first Native American women elected to the House, first Muslim women from Minnesota, 2 of them, first female senator from Tennessee, who is a Republican, and first female, okay, actually, we already know the result in Arizona, so it's obviously Sinema, who I have to give a lot of credit to Martha McSally. Her grace under pressure, under stress, makes Florida look bad. Anyway, she just, said, we'll let this process continue, and then she conceded. All right, first Latina woman from Texas, 2 of them. First female governor from Maine, first female governor from South Dakota, also a Republican. And these last 2 are particularly impressive. Well, I'm talking about Ayanna Pressley and Ocasio-Cortez, because they beat in the primary, in the Democratic primary, people who had been in Congress, men, who had been in Congress for 20 plus years. And then, of course, another African-American woman from Connecticut. Okay? So, all right, so what else? I mean, those are all the facts and figures and whatever. So a lot of things, and a lot of this was covered in the New York Times or the New Yorker and whatever, so I'm not exactly probably surprising you with this, but it's very clear, and Joe had alluded to that as well, that Democrats are nominating more women, and so a lot more of the candidates from the Democratic Party were women. There were a lot more, obviously, arising from primaries or caucuses, and a lot of them did not succeed. But the Democrats have made it a priority to nominate women, and I think that Republicans will look at 2018 and say, maybe we should follow suit, because they were very successful. And all right, but then there was also, I found it a very interesting article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago about female candidates have had a difficulty raising campaign funds. And the whole discussion, nobody really knows exactly what the reason was. But as I mentioned, a lot of these women who were successful were first-time candidates. In fact, some of them without prior political experience, which means quite obviously they don't always have the contacts with business people or people who have money to give. And so it's obviously going to change as more of them are incumbents, but it is an obstacle that people are certainly acutely aware of. Okay, and then, if we're talking about the landscape, the overall landscape and the status of women, there were obviously the losses in Missouri and South Dakota. My brother, who's a public defender in South Dakota, says, you should look at the disenfranchisement of Native Americans on the reservation. You all know this. They were not allowed to use a post office box. Now, in some cases, it spurred them on to actually fixing it. But if you don't know about it and you come, they have election day registration, or actually don't even have registration in North Dakota. So if you go there at the polls and they say, okay, what's your address? And they say, a post office box, they go, no, that's not good enough. And you can't just say, I live on this reservation. So some people were aware of this in advance, and a lot of Native American voters or potential voters caught on to it. And so actually turnout among them, among Native Americans in North Dakota broke records, but a lot of them were still disenfranchised. So states get away with a lot of stuff. Okay, and who knows when we're going to find out about the governor's race in Georgia. She did a remarkably fine job of someone who did have a progressive agenda, and considering Georgia's political makeup, it's amazing it was as close as it was. All right, so gender gap. Joe alluded to this in a slightly different way, but the exit polls, this is all we have to really go on, and we'll find out more if we have survey data, but it's growing. Now, it's not huge. I mean, it's huge, but it's not that much different from 2016. But as I note here, the reason why it's 23-point difference as opposed to, it was already big in 2016, 22 points, but a few men moved to the left and voted for the Democratic Party more than did so in 2016. So there's a lot going on here, right? Now, Oregon, Joe's already alluded to some of this. Turnout was just slightly lower than it was in 2014. And obviously, it was higher in the presidential election. I talked to Phil Kiesling, former Secretary of State, at a conference last week, and he said, and we agreed that part of this is the automatic voter registration. So, I mean, it's a great thing that when you go to the DMV, you're automatically registered. But what does that do? It brings into the electorate, or among the registered voters, a lot of people that are less politically involved and committed to voting. And so it just means that the denominator gets bigger, which we all like, but it does mean that this will change, I'm sure, because they got ballots in the mail and whatever. So it will be a little different, but I think these figures are just figures, and we should be very encouraged by this amount. This is of registered voters, which we typically use in Oregon, comparing it. All right, as you know, no change in U.S. House incumbents. Those 5 seats are really safe. We usually talk about marginal elections in political science as being one where the winner wins with less than 55% of the vote. And that usually often assumes that there's another candidate that gets 45%. In Oregon, it's never quite that clear because you have a lot of people from the independent party or other third and fourth parties. But nonetheless, they look really, really safe. And as Joe was talking about moving into gerrymandering or not gerrymandering, the state doesn't look all that good in terms of that you have 4 safe Democratic seats and 1 very safe Republican seat or district. In most elections for the U.S. House, which is every 2 years, about 41%, I may be alienating you, 41% of all people who vote in a U.S. House election vote for a Republican. But do they have 40% of representatives? No. Why? Because they're all in the 2nd district. Now, am I going to argue in front of the state legislature? I don't know what would happen. I'd probably not make it out of town. Am I going to argue that the other 4 districts should bring in a few more Republicans and make it more competitive? No, that would be kind of against their own self-interest. But Oregon does look as if it does kind of just pack all these Republicans in the 2nd district and then keep the rest of it for the Democrats. And everybody might be happy about it, but it does mean that those races are not very competitive. But what does it mean? That governor's races are always going to be competitive. And this is not the closest race. And in fact, she did much better than expected and much better than John Kitzhaber did in all of his elections and even Ted Gulangowski. The reason why those races are more competitive is that all of those wasted Republican votes in the 2nd district that I was describing, overwhelmingly go for Greg Walden. What happens in the statewide race? All of a sudden, they start to be part of the entire picture, and that's why Democrats and Republicans can go back and forth and why it is always going to be a competitive race. Because we are a blue state, no doubt, but we do have a sizable number of registered Republicans who do vote. And so it's not going to show up in any kind of House race, but it will always show up in the gubernatorial race. All right, and again, I did an analysis of these kind of wasted votes. It's actually called the efficiency gap, and it's used in the Supreme Court decision, the Gill decision. And I actually looked at state House and state Senate districts in Oregon, and in essence, the Republicans are overrepresented just a little bit, not overwhelmingly such that it would be called gerrymandering, in the state Senate, but Democrats are a little more overrepresented in the state House. So I think basically they've just said, we're going to deal with it. We're each going to get a little advantage here and a little advantage there, and that's why redistricting plans for the state House and the state Senate usually don't have trouble passing in the state House, even if there are a lot of Republicans there who might, grumble a bit, because they all sort of said, yeah, this is kind of mutual gerrymandering. Anyway. All right, I will finish up with the ballot measures. This is not surprising that there are a low number of ballot measures. 5 is kind of low for Oregon. And I don't know if you all remember, once we had 2 voter pamphlets, when was it, 1990 or something like that? Because there were so many ballot measures that it required 2 different, the postage was necessary to send out 2 voter pamphlets. We don't have that. We don't have 35 the way we did in 1990. We only had 5. Only the affordable housing measure passed. The other ones, in my opinion, were basically reactive or they're reacting against previous law, or they're trying to prevent a soda tax from being passed, which, obviously the grocery tax thing failed. This is actually pretty typical. I have, with my co-authors, a book coming out on governing Oregon, and when we looked at ballot measures over the years, this was over about 20 years, only about a third of them pass. So this is actually a little worse than usual, but again, the N is small. Okay, so what's next? We're both open to this. Why don't you come back up here? Okay, we're ready. I'll start over.
You speak of progressivism as being a good thing, but why doesn't the progressive, both statewide and federally, speak of dealing with our debt? I mean, progressivism seems to be, let's spend more money, let's give more free things away. But when are we ever going to come to grips with the debt?
I think that's a legitimate question, and it is. There are people of both parties that believe that they're in a massive debt and that it's growing every month, need to be dealt with. But it's also something that the Republican Party, who has championed this, is in the last 2 years actually contributed to the problem. And it does cause division within the Republican Party. I'm talking at the national level. And I mean, Oregon doesn't have the ability to have a debt. But so I think it's a responsibility that needs to be dealt with by both parties. But what was traditionally used to divide the Democrats and Republicans doesn't anymore. We're all doing that, progressive, not progressive, or whatever. It seems to be something that is, people just can't figure out how to spend less on certain things, whatever they are, military spending, welfare. So I just...
But doesn't Oregon have a pension debt?
Oh, Oregon has a commitment to PERS recipients. PERS recipients, and there's 3 tiers and whatever. Oregon cannot run a deficit. So they have to find out how to pay for PERS and prisons and everything else and balance the budget. And if they can't do it, what do? They either cut programs or raise taxes. So you're absolutely right that the PERS burden, and I think everyone in Oregon knows that, is phenomenal, and it's only going to increase. And that's one thing, if I were going to give some advice to Kate Brown, is the issues that Bueller brought up. What had to do with PERS, had to do with graduation rates, had to do with the homeless. Those are all real. And I think not only she, but the entire Democratic Party, with their supermajority, have to try to do something about it. The PERS one, as you all know, has all kinds of legal ramifications. It's not unsolvable. It can't be.
I'd like to segue a little bit from that with the debt. In 2017, our state budget shortfall was in the neighborhood of 20% that came from unfunded mandates from initiatives that had passed. People wanted these things. Yeah. Lots of those people, lots of us didn't realize that since we put this whole we're, am I still on? Yeah. Perhaps we're then losing some of the benefit to other things within the budget that we would support. And I was talking about initiative reform yesterday with Legislative Council in Salem, and we were talking about how to improve this awareness of the budget shortfall causing. And I was shocked to learn that when we use some of these initiatives, they can find that they could be unconstitutional, but they're not able to stop them. They simply put into their advice that a third of our initiatives fail. and they're expensive. If you had a magic.
Okay, so the first thing I would do, and I think you addressed that issue, is to be like Idaho. Idaho, when they have a ballot measure, it has to not be approved by its attorney general, but the attorney general's office has to review it and put a statement on the voter's pamphlet, or the equivalent of which, we do not think this is constitutional. Now, in Oregon, we at least do have a budgetary impact that's listed for every new measure. But I think just taking that additional step of saying we want prior legal review from our own state's attorney's office might dampen the number of initiatives at least.
Thank you. I have one comment and then one question. The comment is, if you the first slide where you had Switzerland at 1971, you might want to bookend the other end and say New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the vote in 1893.
Great.
So
great. Okay, you're right. If I'm going to be truly comparative, I gotta put everybody in.
Yeah, yeah. So my question is about star voting. If you're familiar, you're from Lane County, both of you? Yeah. So if you would like to comment on that and you could follow up, I would be interested in knowing your perspective on that. Thank you.
My sense, I was kind of sad that it failed. I think the star voting system idea is more democratic. It allows, do people know how star voting works? Yeah. Oh, you did. Okay, great. So I think it's a more democratic system. I think it allows voters voter preferences to be more fully realized, and so I think that it's changing a democratic system feels, I think, intuitively dangerous to Americans often, because we're just not used to these kinds of voter systems that are used in Australia and other places. So I'm sad that it lost, but actually I was encouraged that it did so well, and I think that it may not be its last. We may see beginning to see more of this kind of support for these kind of systems going forward. I don't know. We have an actual elections expert here.
No. I mean, I agree with that completely, and I was somewhat disappointed that the Register Guard basically advocated for its defeat. It's a really simple system, and it's not that difficult to understand, etc. And I think that also because it was going to be an experiment, it was really just dealing with local races, an excellent way to sort of say, oh, is there any way to game it? There are still spoiler effects, all those kinds of things. You could do this, and Oregon is innovative in terms of education, and the fact that without trashing the Register Guard, but I'll do it anyway, they just said it's too radical to try this, and that's what they said about vote by mail.
My question is about money in politics. And you made a statement about there are some women who are at a disadvantage for raising money. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's related to whether you're new versus an incumbent or whatever. I am very interested to know whether there will be some very complete studies done to show whether money is always or just usually the biggest influence, because there are races where the person who raised less money did nevertheless prevail and did win. So what do the studies tell us so far about can you win even if you don't raise as much money, and normalize it for, was it incumbents who were raising more or less, or the challenger, and then whether it was male or female?
There's a lot of work on this. You can't always say the person who spends the most money wins. I mean, there are obviously many counterfactuals to that. However, there is a sense of there is a floor, there's a minimal level that every candidate, and it gets higher every single year, has to raise in order to become viable to get out of the starting box. So that's pretty well known. Now, what I'm also worried about it, not so much in terms of candidates, but I'm also worried about it, the power of money in terms of ballot measures, because I've seen many cases in Oregon and in California where you can see the public opinion polls in June and July, and they'll say, oh, we support this or we oppose this, and then you just it goes like this. As soon as the media campaign comes in saying, oh no, we can't do this, and as soon as the $1 million come in from in-state, out-of-state, whatever, you can actually see a reversal of opinion. Now, is this the chicken or the egg? Is this basically voters becoming better informed, or is it the dominance of money? I don't know. But in terms of women, I think I've already addressed sort of why a lot of women in 2018 had difficulty raising money, partly because of their new status as candidates. But a lot of what is done, what the problem with Oregon is, we have no campaign financing. And I did a comparison of Washington, which has campaign financing law, and Oregon and California. And if you're running for governor in California, or someone's running for governor in California, and you are a multimillionaire, you can spend far less than anybody can in Oregon. And the average spending for governor's races, House, Senate, and State House is higher in Oregon than it is in California and Washington. I just find, a lot of it has been complicated or compound ballot measures that have failed over and over again, and there have been some court challenges. I think this is something that really needs to be done. It's just, there are a lot of very large donors out there that give a lot of money, and the whole common cause argument that is nationwide about the quid pro quo, when you give money, you get something in return, is, Oregon is a nice, clean state, but not in this regard.
I wanted to ask about redistricting congressional districts, because I have heard we're going to get a 6th representative. And
after 2020 census. I think that's true. We just missed it 10 years ago.
I know
and
that.
in fact, I think our population per House district is second only to Montana. So we just, Washington got one, obviously lots of other states. So it will be very interesting to see what happens. Of course, there has to be another couple of House races, and some senators might even come up for re-election by the time they have to have the new redistricting plan, as I'm sure you know, in place by 2022 for subsequent races. But it should be very interesting how they're going to do it. Would they do what I recommend, which is maybe make the states a little more competitive? Highly unlikely when you have the legislature, in part with the governor, making these decisions. I'm going to just tick you all off, but I think Oregon also needs a independent commission to do its not gerrymandering, to do its redistricting. Because I have done research with one of our graduate students. When you have a judicial commission in a state, do it. The district lines that emerge, both for state legislature and U.S. House, create more competitive districts. Now, do party leaders like that? No.
I thought that it was the Secretary of State that determined.
No, the Secretary of State, unfortunately, in Oregon has often had to do it. And Phil Kiesling, I don't know how many times he's had to do it. But because basically the State House and the governor, the State House and the State Senate and the governor deadlock. They can't agree on it. And there's so many lawsuits that go back and forth. The last time it did not happen. So we were lucky. But if you look over the years since, Baker versus Carr and Westbury versus Sanders in the 60s, with the exception of 2012, we have always had to have the Secretary of State and the courts intervene. Another reason to take it out of the hands of politicians.
You'll be glad to know the League of Women Voters is pushing that very issue.
Yes, I did know that.
Hello. For many years, I've been very depressed about our younger voters, our younger people not voting, and why that is. And then all of a sudden, Parkland happened. And that seemed to have been a motivating factor for getting our young people to the polls. Are there, number one, is there any statistics showing what Parkland, the shooting at Parkland, had the impact on getting the younger voters for the polls? And also here in Oregon, do we have a percentage of what the younger voters, how many younger voters were here?
I do not know. I do not know that. We do have state-by-state totals of people and who they voted, and they have their age, but it's too soon. I haven't seen the data of it. All I know is what you all read in the New York Times saying that the millennials are participating more than they used to.
I would only add to that partly what happened after Parkland was that other kind of social movement organizations began to connect with Parkland students, connecting them with other groups that are, working against gun violence in Chicago, say, or Black Lives Matter activists, or all other kinds of, young people with different kinds of issues, knitting them together in these broader coalitions. And so, I think partly it's as voting always is. It's a matter of organization and turnout and getting people involved in actual organizational structures.
And I'll just add, for the first time, I actually encourage our younger voters,
Yeah, I think it is encouraging the signs. I mean, there are logical reasons why, maybe not defensible, but understandable reasons perhaps why they don't vote or why they don't register to vote. They're transitory, and they don't have close ties to the community until they have children, get married, do all those things. But my students, at least students at the University of Oregon, even in 2016, I noticed a big difference in just how engaged they seem to be. Now, of course, these are college students, but still, in the past, college students were, they just didn't bother to, get the ballot from their parents or whatever, and they would just not vote. But boy, they certainly have for the last 2 years. So, and, they're getting older and more responsible, so.
Going back to the star voting thing, I think basically we had 3 candidates for president in 2016, and if we had indicated our first and second choices, we wouldn't have wound up with the president we did.
You may very well be right.
Excuse me, I have a question about the census. They're trying to mess with the census now with the citizenship question. What is your best guess about what's going to happen with that, or if they're going to figure out something else to do to mess it up?
I don't know that much, but we do actually have a colleague, Deb Thompson, who has written a book about the census and how political it is. But I don't know much more about what the impact is going to be. But yes, it's a little frightening. Are you going to?
I was going to say I was going to have a question, and wanted you to comment a little bit about what you're working and thinking about the question of racism in this country, because sometimes it's overt and it's always covert. It's clearly a major issue, and although many African Americans were elected, I don't know that that's an answer. So I'm just wondering what your analysis of what's going on in the country now with that.
The issue of racism is you can take it up in a number of different ways, but partly it's if you just decided to look at it economically, any kind of index of social index of how well people are doing, you would find African Americans and Latinos like at the bottom over and over in terms of life expectancy, education, earnings, health, welfare. And so in all ways these are kind of like durable, strong forms of disparity, economic disparity, and it translates also into social disparity. And so these are the grim realities of it. We also have a massive carceral system and a imprisonment system which is dwarfs any other in the world. That blacks and Latinos, particularly African Americans, lead in terms of percentages. And so there are deep and almost seemingly intractable problems there. And they were there before 2016, but now we have this kind of very politicized notion of race, which is quite sharp. And there's open, as we've all seen it, like open forms of white supremacy, open forms of racism, really, which were not sayable before, now are fully sayable. And get said all the time, and they get said by the president, and they get said by members of Congress, and they get said, as I said before, in local races across the country, and there are growing far right and racist social movements or lone individuals, or vast connections being made across internet message boards or social media. And so I think we're in a very perilous time in terms of racial politics, in a way that looks very different than I think most of us have seen in our lifetime. So I think there's been some certain progress in certain regards over time, but there are part of the problem is that in a country that was founded on black slavery and native dispossession, you are going to have deeply built into American history forms of racial stratification and domination. And until those are really worked through and worked out, these kind of things will recur. But I think now, in a time when we have also kind of broader and broader economic gaps between the very rich and everyone else, more white folks are falling off the bottom. And people who probably would have assumed that their whiteness would have indemnified them from certain kinds of economic harm before now don't have that. And that certainly was a profile of Trump voters in the primaries, also in the general electorate, but in the primaries really most acutely, as white people who felt politically powerless and economically disadvantaged went to the polls and voted for Trump. And so, there's that. I think we're going to see a sharpening of that. We've seen it sharpen over, more and more in the last 6 months, even in the last month. And so, and it's, now translates into more open, a more open embrace of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. It becomes murderous and violent. So I don't know. I think there's bright spots I could talk about, but I think it's really important for us to stay focused on how perilous the situation is.
Could I ask just one question? Because this kind of applies to both of you as professors and researchers. And it's about your faith in the randomness of surveys anymore. There was an article in the New York Times in 2015, and this was done by a pollster, who was saying that getting public opinion polls is more and more difficult all the time, and he predicted that the 2016 election would show this, where people wouldn't admit to being Trump voters. Exit polls were widely discredited. In fact, they're not used by major news organizations anymore. So as researchers, when you try to do a study, or when you look at this landscape of how polls are done, by the way, there's no home phones anymore. That's what was used as randomized surveys or polls for years and years and years. But there's no home phones. They're gone. And you can't get, supposedly, cell phone numbers. So it's like, it seems to me, the surveys are self-selective. It's if you want to be active and get on the internet and answer some poll. But as professional, I would say professional, but as scholars, how do you see this field playing out, and how reliable? You just quoted polls, and you just quoted surveys and number of voters. How valid is that in this data?
So could you repeat his question a little for the people who didn't hear it? This was the randomness of polls. Not a lot of landlines don't exist anymore, and do people tell the truth when they're polled?
Well, I do rely on, polls are just polls. Yeah, but say that again? Okay, so what the data that I use if I'm really trying to publish an article that's going to say something slightly definitive about a phenomena is from the University of Michigan, and it is Survey Research Center, and what they do is sometimes they're done by phone, sometimes they're done by in-person interviews, and what is the problem with that? You get very few young people, you get underrepresented minorities, you get a lot of people, poor people are underrepresented if you just cast the net out there. So what they do, there are people whose business is to do this, the few young people they get, the few minorities that they get, they will basically, whatever their responses are, they'll double them up, which is all you can do. Otherwise I don't want to say, I like to be able to not just stand up in front of you and say, well, I think this is why people voted for so-and-so. I would like me to not just be talking. I don't want to treat these surveys, even done by the University of Michigan, as anything more than they are, but I like it to be able to sort of, I made the argument, I don't know how many years ago, was that non-voters are not to be trashed. They are, a lot of them are just alienated from the political system. They are not apathetic. They are not uninformed. And everybody looked at me in North Carolina and go, what are you talking about? Non-voters are dummies. And maybe a lot of you, and I looked at this data that, at least I tested this hypothesis, that was my dissertation, that showed that the non-voter is not someone who is, they're estranged from the political system, but boy, they know who your governor is. They just don't want to vote for the governor. So the only way I could do that was to actually rely on some survey. Otherwise, it was just me talking past my professors. So it's not anything that you're going to say, oh, this is the end answer. But it helps to at least shed some light. And then you get this and you go, all right, and you have all the caveats about what's wrong with this. But then you sort of say, okay, let's improve the survey and ask different questions or so on. So it's just a part of, it's one research tool. In-depth interviews, all kinds of things can shed light on political phenomena as well. And in some cases, I think those are preferable. But, it's just like, how do you do drug testing? How do you do all these kinds of things? You have to have some kind of scientific method. You have to have some way of measurement. Otherwise, otherwise you can say a lot of really good things and have a lot of great analysis. But there are a lot of things you can't do if you just rely on how I think about things.
Political scientists debate exactly this kind of thing all the time.
Exactly.
We have debate in our department even.
Yeah.
So I think that there is, as Priscilla said, it's a tool and a necessary tool. And I think that what in the business they call behavioralists, people who try to study political behavior of voters, continually try to find ways around these problems that public opinion polls come up against. And they are limited, and we saw spectacularly how off so many of them were in 2016. And so there's ways in which there's certain things you can't get at. There are other ways. I don't do quantitative studies that way, or I don't work with survey. I'll do it here because it's a snapshot of the midterm elections. It's hard to say. But I would say that I think that as media outlets have fewer funds for investigative journalists, and I think as political science itself sometimes hews more towards the desire to be kind of quantitative and mathematically sound, you end up with fewer resources for other kinds of political analysis and research. So, it would be that a major newspaper might have, before the 2000 election, may have had more reporters on the ground in Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan, talking to people at the Elks Club, talking to people in local churches, talking to people, in the city council building, at city councils, wherever else, trying to get a sense on the ground of how, talk to political elites, political organizers, other folks who are working these, and you get sometimes a much better sense that way than you can get with polls by actually doing investigative work. Last couple of years as I've been studying kind of the rise of the right, I have been doing it mostly through ethnography or interviewing. So, at Trump rallies, just walking around, talking to a lot of people, asking a bunch of questions about why, what their preferences are, why they have them, what they think about this or that, when did they come to these conclusions, how do they feel about, and then you just kind of like write it all down long form. Or I did the same thing at the Republican Convention in 2016, and most recently I've been interviewing white nationalists and white supremacists and members of fascist organizations about how they came to what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing and what they imagine their impact is. And so partly political scientists, I think, at best use a mixed toolbox of both qualitative, interpretive tools and public opinion polls and other kinds of surveys. Of course, there's other ways of studying political scientists which are not just about behavior, they're about institutions, about political history, about all the other things which help drive politics, which aren't simply about that. But those are, I think you raise a really good and difficult point.
The one book I would recommend, it's written by political scientist Catherine Kramer. She is at the University of Wisconsin. It's called The Politics of Disenchantment, and this was written before 2016. She went around to coffee shops in Wisconsin. She wanted to explain the rise of Scott Walker in a state that has a progressive label, or it has for much of its history. And she did exactly what Joe was doing in that kind of research, and she nailed it. She really nailed it. And she didn't predict predict what was happening in 2016, but she really tapped all of these lower middle class white voters who just had not really economically recovered since the Great Recession.
I'd like to hear your opinion on paper ballots, vote by mail, which we have here, and if that would decrease or extinguish the problems that we have with voting machines, with, you know, the problems that we have, people long lines, people not being able to vote, people's, you know, addresses, whatever, all those problems, and is it being considered nationally?
This is our top vote by mail expert in the country, by the way, right here.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I get calls all the time, and from chairs of state parties and whatever. It is just amazing to me when I watch on election day people waiting in line for 4 or 6 hours in the hot blazing sun, and then they find out, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have your name on the record. I mean, it's just like so antiquated. It's almost as bad as the Electoral College, not quite as much, but anyway, it's really, so I just, more and more states are doing this. It's very defensible. When my children grew up in Oregon and then went to the East Coast before they came to their senses, they said, I can't believe it. I can't believe how difficult it is to vote. My daughter was a medical resident in Albany, New York, and she wanted to vote absentee because she never saw the light of day. You know, she worked. And so in New York, this was not that long ago, in order to vote absentee, you have to print out the ballot on legal size paper. Who has that around their house? And you have to get it notarized, and that's for one election. And so what did she end up doing? Taking a vacation day. I mean, it's just so antiquated. It's just like the Middle Ages. And I mean, I don't know. Okay, the problem in many of these states that are so slow to do this. I mean, they have early voting and they have sometimes no excuse absentee voting, and so that's better. But the problem is that both of the parties, and this happened in Oregon, think the other party is going to get the advantage. And that my own NSF study says not true, because the people who have their voting facilitated by vote by mail are both, get this, young people that we just finished talking about and older people. And so you know how they tend to vote, one for the Democrat and one for the Republican Party. So I don't mean to say it's a wash, but then it has all these people that, you know, get sick or like. Okay, I got to tell this story because this is what really made me a fan of vote by mail. In 1982, 3 people in the political science department were unable to vote because we had to go to the polls. The chair of the department had a bicycle accident the day before and broke, I don't know how many bones in his hands. He was not going to go anywhere. One of my colleagues went out to the parking lot, PLC parking lot, discovered, the battery's dead in his car. He'd left the lights on. By the time his wife came and got him, and he lived in Junction City, and his polling place was 45 minutes away, it was too late. Then I was in the hospital who had a baby who was born 3 weeks late. And so I didn't apply for an absentee ballot. And so I'm going, guess what? I can't leave. And, you know, these are 3 dedicated political scientists who didn't get to vote. And I testify, I mean, there's something wrong with this picture. So anyway, I don't mean to say that we're the ones who are any more deserving to vote than anywhere else, but it's just absolutely nuts to not understand that there are snowstorms and people break hips or people have babies on election day. And, you know, think about Europe. They have election day, they have polls, but they have them on weekends, and they have them often spanning 2 weekends, Saturday and Sunday. It's just, I can only, people need to rise up in these states and say, this is not the way to run the railroad. It's, to say nothing about, you know, whatever. Okay.
One more question. About the guy who was talking about the budget and balancing the budget. That used to be the purview of the Republican Party, but they abandoned that in favor of subsidies to corporations. So tobacco growers are paid to grow and not to grow tobacco, and oil drillers are paid to drill and not to drill. There's a subsidy. They have negative taxes. But the other thing to balance the budget, I saw a guy online that did all the math on single payer, and he said it would save $1 trillion a year because of inefficiencies of insurance companies and so on. And I've worked for an insurance company. I know they're inefficient. But so my question is, also the star voting. If you abolish the primary, that would effectively do that, you save $1 million per election. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would reduce costs, and it would also help third parties, fourth parties. You know this. It would get rid of the spoiler effect. So, yeah, it's an electoral reform that I think should be considered. And, if it took 6 times for Oregon to give women the right to vote, maybe it'll take a few more times for us to consider changing the rules.
Anyhow, on that note and on that rousing defense of vote by mail, I think it's time to say thank you very much to both of you.
I do have a gift for you. So thank you very much. Thank you.